Good day, Radio Free Pizza Gourmets. Here's the man who kind of got me started in the podcasting game, or he had me on as a guest at one point, and I'm delighted to have him here about a year after he and I had our first interview on the old Daniel Natal show. How you doing, Daniel?
Hey, Zachary. I'm doing very well, and it is great to be with you again. And I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
Me too, absolutely. Before we get started on the topics for today, I'm curious, what happened to the Daniel Natal show? I know that you stopped doing it, but you're busy writing a book right now. Is there any?
Yeah, I just had so much other stuff going on. I record audiobooks professionally. I've got an indie publishing company. And so, I was just so bogged down with all the other stuff that it was really hard for me to do all the stuff. As you know, the hardest part of like having a show like that is you schedule guests. And sometimes the guests show up. Most of the time they do, but every once in a while, some snafu happens or some technical glitch happens and you're left panicking. And so there's like a lot of like behind the scenes stuff, or somebody wants you to read a book. Like I had a gentleman who is a supply chain expert, wonderful man. But he was like, here, read my 500-page book before you interview. So there's a lot of work that goes into what you're doing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be nuts. 500 pages. Well, I've read your book and I'm looking forward to the next one. But the topic for today that I'm curious about doesn't have too much to do with actionable ethics. I'll put a link in the show notes for everybody who's interested. So,
yeah, it does touch on, however, on the book that I'm working on now, like some of the themes and topics, because from what I understand, you wanted to talk about kind of the influence of the international bond market on kind of geopolitics and how that ties into Trump wanting to buy Greenland or making a bid for Canada, that kind of stuff, or Panama Canal.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm actually in Panama right now. So,
sweet.
Yeah, it's pretty nice down here. I mean, it's nice and warm at least. But yeah, I am particularly curious because you were the fellow who turned me on to the idea of purchasing Greenland being really stimulating for the bond market. Can you elaborate on why sovereign debt is so central to maintaining that kind of economic stability or the stability of the ruling financial system?
Yeah, exactly. That's more accurate. The ruling financial system, the Anglo-American Empire, is held together, and previously the brand name was the British Empire, and so it starts. With the concept of bonds is very old. I mean, you can go back to the 1200s, and people had in Italy, where that was like kind of the financial center of Europe at that time period, and you had families like the Medici, famously. And they were called prestiti, bonds. But the thing was, they were just local. Like somebody would loan money to the government. The government would pay them back. There'd be a coupon rate, all that kind of stuff that is associated with bonds today. But it was just local. It was just local oligarchs would, pay money for a bond for municipal projects or war. More often, it was war. And it wasn't until this group of guys called the Baring brothers. They had a father from Germany, and they moved to England. And the boys were born in England in the 1700s. And in 1762, they create something called the Baring Brothers Merchant Bank. And the Baring Brothers Merchant Bank, essentially created the sovereign debt, the international sovereign debt market. They did that concept that you could have a Brazilian buying an English bond, or you could have an Argentine buying a German bond, and an American buying a Russian bond, et cetera. So they created this international infrastructure. And it was really to help, buoy up the British East India Company. And that, essentially becomes the British Empire across the world. And it was financed for those three purposes, for infrastructure. Like a big one was canals. Like the Erie Canal was financed by the Baring brothers in the United States. Lots of rail, lots of factories like Buffalo, Albany, like all these cities were actually financed by bonds that the Baring brothers were the principals on. And also war was a huge one. Either you want to go to war or you have to rebuild infrastructure after a war. But the third one is interesting. The third reason, the Baring brothers were in South America. They were there as Argentina became, I think, the sixth richest country in the world. And then it collapses when they had this thing called canal, the canal bust, happens. But before that happened, they were there essentially as agents of the British Empire, and their rival would be the Spanish Empire. And so they were there basically fomenting revolutions, so that you could, destroy their rival, the Spanish Empire, and you create all these little countries, these rump states within that former empire. And you get Argentina, you get Bolivia, you get, Uruguay, you get all these different countries, Chile. And every time a new country comes into being, you get a bond. So it's really interesting seeing them. There's a French academic, and his name is Simon Legrand, I think his name is, and he talks about the British East India Company and how they would use as cells Freemasonic lodges. They would basically, everywhere the British East India Company went, they would put these lodges, and Englishmen could network and kind of rise up in the world, get newspapers from back home, and made them feel at home. And they were kind of like consulates. They were half embassy for the British Empire in a place, and they were half intelligence agency. They would feed intelligence back to the Brits. And so a lot of these revolutions, like in Argentina, for one, they would have like a Freemasonic guy would come in, a Freemason, and he would basically get a revolution going, a color revolution, very much like George Soros in the modern time period. Yeah, and so when you go back and you research the origins of the Argentinian Revolution, or Simon Bolivar, the great George Washington of South America, was a Freemason. And these people were like, British parliamentary democracy. We want British parliament, and so the monarchy would fall, or imperial system would fall, and it would be replaced by a British parliamentary democracy. And now they're plugged into the English system. And that was the thing. The French caught down to this very early, like in the 1700s. They were like, we noticed that all these Freemasonic lodges keep promoting democracy and British, these British like setups, and they're against the monarchy. They're against our local government and culture, and they want to kind of graft on this British system. Hitler talks about it when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses, and the rump state of Austria comes up, a much tinier country. And he says, yeah, and they adopted this British parliamentary democracy. The cross is removed from the flag. It's no longer part of Christendom. Christendom is gone because these people didn't want thrones and altars. So they don't want kings. They don't want a clergy class. They don't want the Catholic Church. Everything is gone, and now it's ruled by corporation, and it's British East India Company. And so the bond market was kind of central to this. So every time you see revolutions, every time you see a new nation rising or falling, or the EU in 1999, and new bonds are stimulated by this new economic activity. So when you look at history through the financial lens, you realize that revolutions are not what they appear to be. They're not grassroots. Oh, the people just rose up and, for no reason, threw off their, 1,000-year-old culture and adopted this new British parliamentary democracy.
Absolutely. That's actually what you're describing fits the Panamanian Revolution very well. That was stoked by business interests from the United States. I don't know exactly about the bonds that they issued, but I imagine they issued some bonds once they broke away from Colombia.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. If you read Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution by Anthony Sutton, he talks about this one location in New York, and it's something like 234 Broadway was the location. And these bankers essentially were behind the Panamanian Revolution. They were behind the Mexican Revolution of 1914. They were behind the 1911 revolution in China. They were behind the Bolshevik Revolution. And all of them were run out of the same address. And a lot of times, once the revolution happened, like when the Russian Revolution happened, the embassy was put at that exact same address right up the hall from them. So you would have Trotsky, or some, like Russian figure like showing up, and so the book starts with that, with these Trotsky gets arrested in Canada because it was during World War I, and they had a thing against aliens being there, or they spies, what's going on. So the Canadians arrest Trotsky. He's found with $10,000 on his person in cash. He's got a chauffeur. He's living in a penthouse apartment in New York with no visible means of support. And back then, just to put this in context for your viewers, the average yearly income of a teacher was $1,000, right? So he had $10,000. So imagine that. So if the average yearly income of a teacher today is like 50,000, do that by 10, and that's the cash he had just on his person. And so they pick him up. He's a suspicious individual. He's got no business being in Canada, and the State Department intervenes and says, you're to let him go. You're to give him an American passport, even though he's not an American, and you're going to put him on a ship to Germany, and then from there train to Russia. because he was an agent doing the revolution for these bankers, and was protected from up on high,
Mhm.
you know. And so all these revolutions, none of these were organic from the people. You know, Trotsky was not an organic, you know, that's the way the world works. So we're watching that play out right now with as the financial system is under duress, and the bond market is on the ropes in many ways. And in Europe, they were having bonds with negative interest rates, which for the first time in history. Like, why would you get a bond if you don't even get your principal back? That's insane. So the bond markets were really hurting. And Edward Dowd, as I shared an article with you, he's the guy who was formerly at BlackRock. He was a portfolio manager or whatever. And he said, yeah, the whole last, I don't know if I can say it without getting you in trouble, but the last medical health emergency that took place on the globe, he said, was basically a cover for protecting the bond market, that they printed up 65% more money. And a lot of that went to the bond market to hold it up. So, you know, the bond market is very fragile right now, and they could really use an issuance of, like Greenland going to the United States, just like the Baring brothers, who I mentioned earlier. They were the brokers on the Louisiana Purchase, and they were the brokers on the Alaska Purchase with William Seward. And that's what caused our conversation, because you were the one. I read your great article on this, and you said William Seward, the same guy who bought Alaska for the United States, made a pitch in 1868 to buy Greenland.
Yeah.
You know, so these things cause these generate bonds, and these help prop up that system. If that system collapses, then the whole Anglo-American system that they've had since the 1700s, actually 1600s, but more pointedly, like the 1760s, from there on, I mean, that whole system goes down.
Oh, wow. So this is interesting. I've definitely encountered ideas about the need to prop up the bond market right now. But what I've noticed, until you started telling me about the potential that bonds could fund the purchase of Greenland today, I've noticed that those usually dealt with, for example, Whitney Webb. Just very briefly, as best I can recall it, she was suggesting that the current push by the Trump administration, like calling himself the crypto president during the campaign, that was actually about creating dollar-denominated stable coins that would be backed by U.S. treasuries. So it's a sort of, it's a double-edged sword, I suppose. The idea that they need to introduce this kind of tokenized system that would seem somehow revolutionary or like a change in the financial system, but it would really still be sort of just a petrodollar, but revised, no longer.
And backed by bonds, right? Treasuries, U.S. treasuries, so backed by bonds. So they need that bond market to be healthy and robust when it's not. And so, just for your viewers too, I wanted to make the point. If you read Charles Beard, back in 1913, he had this book, The Economic Interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. And he talks about how the American Revolution, was fought for the Articles of Confederation. That was what the people thought they were getting. They were getting a republic, right? The Articles of Confederation. And they had that for about 15 years. And then the bond markets weighed in. And these financiers said, hey, we don't want to get paid back for the bonds that we paid to finance the American Revolution with worthless continental fiat currency. Because at the time, Vermont had its own currency, New Jersey had its own currency, New York had its own currency, Pennsylvania, et cetera, et cetera. And they had hyperinflated their currency, so it was worthless fiat. And they were like, you know what? We don't want to get paid back in worthless fiat. We want you to go back. We want you to rewrite a constitution where your dollar is pegged to gold. So when you reimburse us for our bonds, we don't lose our shirts. And so the current United States Constitution was a creation of the bond markets. Like, people don't realize that, like, the power of these, these bond markets. They can make a country rise, or they can make a country fall. They can collapse that country. And the power of that, so all these new states that we live in, these republics, like, that was like the big thing, like there was anybody can go and research this, by the way, the revolutions of 1848. Sure. Right. The revolutions of 1848, like 9 countries collapse all in 1 year. They're monarchies, or they're part of Christendom, whatever. They collapse in 1 year, and then they reconstitute as republics, as British parliamentary democracies. As I said before, the cross is gone from their flag, and it's usually a tricolor flag. There's usually some Freemasonic guy like Garibaldi, involved in it, or Mazzini, like all the, it's kind of like the American founding fathers. All of our founding fathers were Freemasonic people with ties to the British East India Company. So all these states are not what they appear to be. These are not grassroots grassroots creations of popular sentiment or some evolutionary understanding or whatever, like this global culture, this which is really just British, British imperial culture, British East India Company
Mhm.
culture. Is being imposed, and it is very synthetic, and we're watching this happen right now. They've got a blueprint, and they're doing this right now. They'll go to Abkhazia, they'll go to Georgia, they'll go to Uzbekistan, they'll go to all these countries all around the world, and they will kind of, oh, don't you want a British parliamentary democracy? Why would you want your own culture? You want to be ruled by like the bond markets in a central bank, don't you? Isn't that isn't that the way that everything should be run from now on?
Mhm.
So I don't know.
Oh,
That's what we're watching.
all right, interesting. I'd like to back up a second. You made the comparison between the Baring Brothers Mercantile Bank and George Soros. Please enlighten me. When George Soros goes into a country, like I understand that his foundation was funding the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. When things like that happen, does that involve like Ukraine was issuing bonds at that point to pay for their new shift in government regime?
Yeah, I mean, that happens as well. I mean, George Soros is kind of the poster child for that just because everybody knows his name. But I mean, they're like John Perkins famously wrote that book, Confessions of an Economic
Sure.
Hitman. And so, how whenever a new regime comes in, he was dispatched from like the IMF, right, the International Monetary Fund, to go into the country and make the deal, offer the standard deal to the new person in the regime. And the standard deal was you will have certain reforms that you will institute. For instance, property taxes. Like if your country doesn't have property taxes, like Nepal or Tibet or any of these countries, we used to not have property taxes, by the way, and but you're going to have property taxes on your people, and that money will go to the IMF, right? So we're basically going to impoverish your people. We're going to damage their economic activity. All the money will start being siphoned out of your country. You, however, will be a billionaire. We're going to make you and your friends billionaires. You'll have mansions, but the rest of your country will be enslaved, will be a debt slave from now on. And by the way, I did a presentation once on the Sumerians. The Sumerian word for freedom was amadgi, and it meant to be without debt. So if you're in debt, you're a slave. And so that's the deal. And he said only 3 people he was aware of didn't take the deal, and one was Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, one was Saddam Hussein, and I can't remember the third one. It might have been Mohammed Mossadegh, but yeah, they didn't take. These were men of integrity that we were told were vicious, evil dictators, bad people. Maybe Gaddafi was one of them. But most people take the deal. Where they enslave their populace, put them in debt bondage, and you will get. And a big part of this is infrastructure loans, right? So well, I don't need a new airport. Well, you're going to get another airport. You're going to get 3 airports. You don't really need them. There's not really that much traffic, but we need to give this contract to Halliburton, and we're going to create a bond on those things. And we know that you can't pay back those bonds, but you have collateral, and the collateral is going to be the gold in your country, or the collateral is going to be the nickel or the cadmium or the lithium. So whenever there is a discovery of a new deposit of lithium or one of these, rare earth minerals that we need for CCTV cameras in our growing surveillance state, you will see the dispatch of the economic hitmen, like in Bolivia. They'll go when Bolivia discovered lithium, suddenly Evo Morales is deposed, and you get this new regime comes in. They take the deal, that the economic hitman offers, and the IMF gets their resources. They purposely put them in debt through infrastructure loans, bonds, and then they basically use as collateral all the natural resources of the country plus the tax base, which is the taxes coming from the populace from property taxes. This, by the way, leads in my book Actionable Ethics, which you mentioned. I talk about the global slave markets. And a big trigger for that is when the IMF goes in and they institute property taxes in a new country, a conquered country. And the people never had to do that because they own their land for like hundreds of generations, like in Nepal, right? This has been our family farm since 1300 AD. What do you mean we don't own our own land? This is our land. And they're like, no, you now have to pay property taxes, but we're not even on the money system. We make all our own food. We make all our own clothing. We don't have money. We barter for what we need. Well, you're going to need money now. So take your oldest son and he will go to an international employment agency, and they will put him in China, and he's going to work in a sweatshop, 23 hours of the day. And we're going to take his passport away. And he will be able to work to basically, pay your property taxes, because we're going to pay him $50, a day. And then when he gets there and they take his passport away, it's not $50 a day, it's 50 cents a day. And he can never leave. and he's now a slave. And so these employment agencies are tied into this IMF system, this larger global debt system, where these people are literally being made into slaves, whether in a factory or whether in a sex setting, or organ harvesting. Like, all of this is tied together, and it's all tied to debt, and that debt is called bonds. Kind of, and just making a pun on that. That would be like George Soros would be like James Bond. Right. He's like, I'm here to impose bonds on your country and tax slavery and British parliamentary democracy.
Oh, geez. Well, that's a lot of that is kind of horrifying, but thank you for sharing nonetheless, despite my horror. Oh, gosh, this is just the way the world works. Well, getting back to Greenland for a second, I'm curious, how would you estimate the effect on the financial system if bonds were issued to facilitate the United States purchase of Greenland? That seems to me like it would have massively negative ramifications for the general American population. Am I on the right track? Or?
Well, I mean, just going back to the concept of natural resources, right? So Greenland allegedly has like lots of minerals, lots of mineral wealth. And if they acquire Greenland and a bond is generated, then those natural resources would be collateral, and would not go to the United States. They would basically go to whoever is doing the bond, which is going to be City of London. Like you sent me an article about Trump's Treasury Secretary, and he was being questioned by Tom Cotton, and they were talking about the Bank of England being the broker between all these bonds, all this debt restructuring. And that's essentially what's happening right now. Is the United States is being looted. We're in debt. And so what is happening, that Department of Government Efficiency is really, straight out of the World Economic Forum. Elon Musk was a young global leader in 2008. And so he is not a populist. He's not here to help the American people. He's basically here to say, okay, the United States is heavily in debt. You have your natural resources as collateral. And we want that gold in the Chocolate Mountains region. We want your uranium in Texas. We want like all these things. So he's basically going to itemize this stuff for a debt restructuring program. He's going to tokenize it, so it can be sold now on the international markets. Like historically, when a war happened, you would have one country invade another country for its resources. That is the baseline definition of war. You get invaded for your resources. So what they're going to do is take our resources and pre-steal them. And then, so you don't have to wage war now. China does not have to wage war to get our lumber, because they don't have much lumber. 3/4 of their country is desert. So they need lumber. So now they can just buy a token. Elon Musk will create a token so they can basically get, America's, rainforests in the Pacific Northwest, or its arable land in the Midwest for their food security needs and stuff. So we're being pre-hollowed out. They're creating this digital infrastructure, this architecture to basically move our water. So imagine right now you get a glass of water. I used water to make this cup of coffee. And, and if the people own that water, then you can get the water for very cheap, maybe half of a penny for that water. But if Saudi Arabia or Kuwait owns that water, right, the water tables in my area, then that water might go up to $1, like a glass. It might go up to $2 a glass, $12. Why would they care? They're not going to be there. They're going to be thousands of miles away. Why would they not raise the prices on you? So we're on the cusp of like the raping of the United States. And yeah, so those, long story short, the natural resources that are there in Greenland, they're not coming to the United States, but a bond will be generated, and they'll be going to, by way of England, the Bank of England, to the IMF or one of these international agencies that is a sock puppet for the British financial system.
I see. And I suppose then that the same would be said of all the natural resources that would be included in Trump's proposed sovereign wealth fund for the United States. Is that right?
Yeah, isn't that funny? Yeah, exactly. He was talking about like that's based on Norway. Norway has this wonderful sovereign wealth fund where they discovered oil in the North Sea, and they started socking away money for their own citizens, which is nice. I mean, like Alaska's like that. You move to Alaska, instead of you paying the state will generate a check, and because they want more people there, and they will pay you to go live in Alaska, and you might get like $2,000 at the end. Oh, cool, And we're doing that in Norway, and the Saudis famously, and all these Kuwait, all these oil, petrodollar countries in the Middle East, they have these massive secret sovereign wealth funds. that go around buying, Paramount Pictures or buying, McDonald's, fast food restaurant, whatever. And you don't even know who they are. They're very opaque. They don't really want you to even know that they, what they're doing. So Norway, as a European country, they're a lot more transparent. So how many trillions of dollars they have and what they're doing with it. But the Middle Eastern countries, very, very sketchy activities like all around the world. And that's something. So Trump basically is like he's talking about creating like an American sovereign wealth fund, but really we already have a sovereign wealth fund and it's not benefiting America. I mean, it's this financial system. I wanted to just in a digression for your viewers as well to talk about just really quickly. I mentioned the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, that was originally created to do German World War I debt, right? Yet it's still there. Yet German World War I debt was paid off, and I think in 2010, I think it was paid off or thereabouts. And so it was supposed to just do that. And there was a guy named Hjalmar Schacht who was the head of the Reichsbank in Germany in 1919. And he talked to an Englishman, Montague Norman. And Montague Norman was like the head of the Bank of England and the whole kind of global empire financial structure that we're talking about. And he went to Norman and he said, why don't we create, like he said, Germany is so blown up and destroyed. There's no hope of paying back these exorbitant debts that you guys, you're asking us to pay back. We don't have it. You're trying to get blood from a stone, but I have an idea. He said, what if we create central banks and we basically put central banks in every country of the world where they don't exist right now, right? Only a handful of countries in 1919 have central banks. We're going to get them in Bolivia. We're going to get them in Mexico. We're going to get them all over the world. And you are going to encourage them to buy German industrial goods, German tractors and German cars, Volkswagen, that kind of stuff. And then we'll get enough money to pay off these loans to the IMF, and so this money will go to the IMF, and then it will go to the Allied victors, And so they said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. From 1919 on, let's create this, and they did it through the Bank of International Settlements. They created the Bank of International Settlements, which is the central bank of all the world's central banks. And they created it in Switzerland. And so it was Montague Norman and Hjalmar Schacht are the two names. And that's the system we're living in. We're living in the system where they went and they conquered all these countries. Like, oh, you don't have a central bank in your country, Iraq? Oh, you do now. We're going to conquer you, destroy you, blow you up. And now you've got that central bank that is against Islam. Because in Islam, you're not allowed to charge interest. But you know what? We're getting rid of that. And now you're a British parliamentary democracy with a central bank. Isn't that wonderful? And so it's going to pay back German World War I reparations that no longer exist. So the whole IMF system, there's no reason for it to exist, but it was so lucrative once they finally got that infrastructure in place that after 2010 and German World War I reparations are done, they're like, they're sitting pretty. They're like, oh, nobody's noticed that we're still running and operational when our mandate, the very telos of what we were designed for, the aim of what we were, constituted to do is gone, but they're still giving us money. So we have trillions of dollars of the world's assets coming and being pooled in this slush fund, and nobody's noticing, And it's a really beautiful system for that handful of people. But yeah, a good book to read on that is the Tower of Basel. It talks about the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, and how every country now has a central bank. Why that is, and why we're here. So,
oh man. God, this is such a nightmarish system. I'm wondering, what do you see like from your vision of history that you provided over certainly the past several centuries, like the British parliamentary system being instituted in these quasi-color revolution situations? How do you see the odds that humanity can free itself from this bizarre little system? Like, the bond market has been very unstable, as you mentioned, with Edward Dowd. And it seems like whether it's through using US dollar denominated stable coins to prop up the bond market, or by doing these land deals, like issuing bonds for the purchase of Greenland or the Panama Canal. Basically, what do you think that the common folk of the world can do to get back to more of a system like the Nepalese family that you were describing, where, hey, this is just our land. Like we're not dealing with that. We don't want to have our natural resources looted from us by just wealthy overseas nations.
Yeah, Alvin Toffler talks about that in what was it? The Third Wave, I think, is the name of the book, in 1980, and he talks about like the euphemisms of creating new markets, and he was like, well, what does that mean? And he said, like, it means like there's an African, sub-Saharan African tribe, and they're not in the money system, right? They're self-sufficient, make all their own clothes, all their own food. They're outside of this Anglo empire structure, and so you don't want that. You don't want them to be outside the system. So you will dispatch, the Peace Corps, and the Peace Corps will come and tell them, you don't really want your own culture, do you? You don't really want your own religion and your own legends and your own, kind of oral traditions and everything like that. You really want to be part of this global system, don't you? And it raises all, the tide raises all ships, and you'll be so much wealthier if you get into this money system. And so, one of the things he talks about was, they will install a dictator in that country, and the dictator will take the deal. He will be rich, and he will enslave his population. He will have men with machine guns say, okay, you're leaving your family farm to go to the lithium mines, and we will make sure that you're in the lithium mines or the blood diamond mines or whatever. And you will be doing this now for 23 hours a day. And their response is, oh, but if I'm doing that, how can I farm? How can I make food for my family? And then, oh, that's great. You can't farm now. So now you're going to have to buy, goods and services from Walmart. You're going to have to buy, goods and services. So now we've created a new market, right? But what we've done is we've essentially destroyed that culture, because we've taken the men away, and now the women have to go to work to get the money to buy the food that previously they didn't have to buy. Right. So now the women are gone, the men are gone. So cultural transmission is disrupted as nobody is teaching the children. But that's the best part, because the globalists are going to send in schools, and they're going to teach the children not their own culture, but they're going to teach them that, feminism. They're going to teach them the glories of, women not having families and being in a cubicle, or LGBT or gay marriage, and they don't really need their own culture. Right. I mean, that's so passé. And now they're debt slaves, and they're fragmented. There's nobody raising the children. Crime rises, because the systems that were in place to make sure that young men behave themselves are gone. They're not out in the family field. So you get this Mumbai, kind of like slums start to develop, as the corporate structure shunts people off the farms that they were historically on. This is happening in India, like that. I'm not just saying Mumbai just randomly, where the new system comes in, the new capitalistic system. And this happened in the Industrial Revolution, by the way, in England. The factories needed young men to work in those factories. So they got them out of the provinces, off the family farms. The farms collapsed. You had great industrial production on shoes or whatever, doodads, but food suddenly became super expensive because the farms went down to the extent in the 1700s that it took a week's wages for a worker to buy a loaf of bread. So their priorities were all off. Oh, look, I can get a Rubik's Cube for so cheap, but I can't eat. And the same process is now happening as they industrialize. It's happening in India, it's happening in China, it's happening in Africa, and it's creating slums. As the farms are kind of taken away, they go down, which the globalists love, because they want that land, right? They want you off the farms anyway. They want your land because that's real wealth. But this plays into also what happened in the revolutions of 1848. In the revolutions of 1848, why did that happen at that time period? And the answer was because that's when the Industrial Revolution hit Central Europe, right? So when the Industrial Revolution hit Central Europe, suddenly there was all this unemployment. All these people lost their jobs as technology and new factories came in. Textile workers suddenly, oh, I'm good at weaving, but the machine can do it much faster, much cheaper. I lost my job. What do I do? So with the mass unemployment, the people basically, it created the conditions for revolution. And right now, with the Fourth Industrial Revolution, they're terrified of the same thing happening in the West now, where all these people are going to be displaced with their, from their jobs. And one of the big things in the revolutions of 1848, one of the lead ups was this creation of the surveillance state to try to tamp down on revolution. And so we've seen that here, where we have this massive surveillance state that requires all these lithium and nickel and silver and all these things, which is why we're getting all these resources from around the world to create this infrastructure, because they are terrified of the Fourth Industrial Revolution being like how every other industrial revolution has been. It has been catastrophic sociologically to any country that's hit it, And by the way, it's also associated with population decline. By generation 4, of an industrial revolution switchover from a traditional culture to the industrial revolution culture, children become much more expensive in a city than they were in the farm. When you're in a farm, children are an asset because they're more labor, right? So the more children you have, the more wealth you can generate, and it's good. It's a win-win. When you shut those people into a city now, where the children they have no like work value, and now they're a cost. So people tend to have less children because they're so expensive in the city, in the urbanization phase. And so all of a sudden you see people having 10 children, 8 children, 6 children, 5 children, 2 children, a dog. And it just goes down. And that's what's happening right now all across the West, all across China. They're seeing population collapse. India, they're seeing population collapse. Like they're going to have a peak from when they were agrarian, and then it's going to start going down. And this is a very well documented phenomenon. It's an anti-human system.
It's terrible. I think that's a very well chosen word, anti-human. Like going back to my old, I guess I would say more anarchist days, I certainly had just the instinct that the world that I was raised in, like the West, the United States, had an anti-human bent, and getting a sense of how that operates is really helpful. Thank you.
Well, the book I'm working on right now, it starts in 1600, and it starts kind of in the shadow of the Protestant Reformation, and it talks about like Mark Carney, of all people. Mark Carney used to run the Bank of England, so he's a bad guy. He's now running for office in Canada. Yeah, and he wrote this book called Values, and it was an interesting book. And he talks about how from Aristotle all the way until the Catholic canonists in the 1500s, economics was a subset of ethics. So you could do economic activity, but there was a goal, and it was to help the people. And the people were there in that goal. And in my book, Actionable Ethics, I actually track like the definitional change of economics. And it used to be about what benefited the people. And then around Milton Friedman, they took the people out altogether. And they said, oh, it's just the allocation of scarce resources. And the people were removed. The whole purpose of the system was removed. And so Mark Carney admits that. He said from Aristotle all the way till Christendom, till the 1500s with the Catholic world, that you could not do certain things if it hurt the people. Like for instance, usury. Usury was illegal under the Catholic Church, so you couldn't create debt slaves. So they had basically their model was wealth creation. The older Middle Eastern model was wealth extraction, slaves. Right. Wealth extraction is slaves. You get people into debt and stuff like that. And so the Catholics were against that, just like modern Muslims. Islam is also against wealth, exploitation and stuff, wealth extraction. And so when the Protestant Reformation happened, it happened as a result of there were crop failures in the 1500s, and Northern Europe broke away because they couldn't really. It was hard for them to live in the feudal system that Christendom had developed. So it was tied to the land. Everybody was a farmer, and that worked really well in France and Italy and Spain and Greece and stuff because they were warm. They had warm climates. In Northern Europe, they had cold climates with rocky soil, and historically they made their living off the sea, the Vikings and stuff like that, because they couldn't really eke much of an existence out of the soil. And so for a little while they were in Christendom, and they were trying to be farmers and stuff, trying to be peaceful. But when these crop failures happened in the 1500s, the German princes were like, hey, what do? We need to stay in power. Let's rob the church. We're going to go in and we're going to rob all these church lands, all these abbeys and all these things. And we are going to stay in power. But it's going to obviously create a rift between us and the church. So they created this narrative of, oh no, we left the church because of indulgences, or the church was corrupt, but really they robbed the church. That's what happened. And the same phenomenon happened in England. And then they revert to their piracy model, their pre-Christian piracy model, where it's, like, oh, Britannia rules the sea. So everything is about sea. Christendom is land-based. The new model, the Protestant model, is sea-based. And they align themselves with kind of, there were two groups who basically were alienated from Christendom. One was, the Protestants, because they had just robbed the church, and one was Jews. And so they went over to the Jewish kind of wealth extraction. Usury is now good. So they created this mutant version of Christianity. Let's call it Judeo-Christianity, where now wealth extraction, was allowed, was permissible, and not just permissible, but it was lauded. Wealth extraction as opposed to wealth creation. And you would basically create slaves, and you would create not just slaves on an individual level, and Marx talks about this, Karl Marx, but you would create slavery on a national level, right? Where you would have whole countries in debt servitude, and that's the system we're in now, and that's what the bond structure is, what the IMF is. It's about getting entire nations and continents into debt. And the only way out of this, Yuri Bezmenov, the KGB agent who defected years ago, he wrote down what is the way out of what's happening, and he wrote on a board God. God. So there is another system out of this, and it's not. We've been told a fake binary, false choice. Oh, you can have capitalism or you can have communism, but there's a third choice, and it's Christendom. Right? We had another system, and it was real, and it worked for 1,500 years. But they don't want you to know that that's an option, right? Because if you're in that system, then their whole kind of grift debt-based system goes under. But yeah, and like I said, I'm not advocating for a particular religion, or because like I said, Islam too has an anti-wealth extraction system that they're trying to take down. And by the way, everybody talks about Rothschild bankers. Oh, the Rothschild central bank, and they're trying to take down Iraq or Iran or Yemen or any of these countries and then put in a Rothschild central bank. The Rothschilds gained power because the Baring brothers in the 1820s, they lost their shirt in the canal bust, the same canal bust that did the Erie Canal in the United States. And that's when the Rothschilds came up, when the Baring brothers lost their shirts on the canal bust. Then the Rothschilds came. And we've been with them for quite a bit.
God, what incredible news! That's a fascinating detail there about the rise of the Rothschilds. I mean, surprised that I hadn't heard it before. Like, I was just in an interview the other day, a couple months ago now, talking about the Rothschilds and the various ways that they, for example, were implicated in the rise of Christian Zionism as a way of establishing or helping to establish the Palestinian protectorate under the British Empire. And I suppose bonds must have been involved with that too. Do you happen to,
Yeah, like everything, the whole post-World War II system. I mean, that is the apotheosis of the zenith of the power was in the post-World War II system. And that's when Israel was created. The CIA was created in 47. Israel was created in 48. So all of this infrastructure, the Bank of International Settlements, like the UN, like all these things were just boom, boom, boom. NATO was, I think, 49. And that basically NATO was the ultimate kind of conglomeration of what had formerly been the American Republic with England, and they had united, and it was supposed to be temporarily for World War II. And then they were supposed to decouple. And then after World War II ended, they were like, just kidding. We're going to keep World War II going forever. And I tweeted that recently. I said, the big danger is not World War III. The big danger is World War II never ended. And I showed like an engram, a Google engram of the usage of the word Nazi. In 1955, 10 years after World War II ended, Nazi was like, nobody really, that wasn't part of the popular discourse. Nobody cared. It was over. That was part of the, that was as irrelevant as Hirohito in Japan at that point. Nobody talked. And then you go to 2025, Nazi, 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 Nazi. And it's in the discourse. Every politician, oh, I'm not a Nazi. Oh, look at those Nazis there. Oh, the Nazi, and they're so more obsessed on Nazis, 70 years after the events than the people who fought the literal Nazis, World War II never ended. And once World War II ends and countries kind of break back apart and we stop having these massive nation states, and that's what's going to happen, according to Lord William Rees-Mogg. He was the financial advisor for Lord Rothschild. And he wrote this book called The Sovereign Individual, and he correctly saw the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And he said that you're going to see cryptocurrencies. He predicted cryptocurrencies back in the 90s. And he said you're going to see the collapse of large, like nation states, continent-sized nation states like the United States, like Canada. He saw Canada falling before the United States, breaking up into 2 or 3 separate countries. And he said the United States would eventually break up into 2 or 3 separate countries, and then smaller countries from that. And that's going to create bonds, lots of bonds. Whenever you have these shifts, there's a reason for it, and it's not because the people woke up. It's because the financial system ran its course. It could no longer extract anything, so now they've got to reshake the puzzle pieces in the box and then create a new configuration, and that will give more life to the economic system. But the ultimate way out of this is essentially to go back to our own traditional cultures, for Africans to stop trying to have British style nation states that that's not part of their culture or history, or Indians to basically retake their tribal structures and tribal systems, and, China to be China, Japan to be Japan, and for us to essentially, Islam, he gets to have Islam, and they have this structure that is not based on British imperial, British parliamentary democracy, and that's okay. It's okay for them to not be, to have their own culture, in their own zone. But that essentially will be, the salvation of the people, is if they return to some kind of system where you have ethical guardrails above the economic system, like we used to under Christendom. We had a structure above. And there was this, just really quickly, there was this Italian historian named Arrighi, Giovanni Arrighi, and he talks about how the Treaty of Westphalia, when the modern nation state is invented in 1648, they made the assertion just to get away from Christendom, right? So they wanted to get away from the church, and they were like, okay, no thrones, no altars, just to repeat that phrase. And they said, no authority is higher than the nation state. And we're making that assertion. No authority is higher than the nation state. And he said that was true until the British said, oh, well, there is something above the nation state, and that's going to be the free market. The free market is above the nation state. And he calls it British free market imperialism. Right. So now you have this system, the structure that is above the nations, that is above the voters. Right. The World Economic Forum is essentially, this structure, this British free market imperialism structure above. So they're occupying the part that had previously been occupied by the Pope. Right. And instead of a college of cardinals, you have a college of corporations. And so they've made this assertion, oh, there is something above the nation. And this is why people don't understand. Hey, I keep voting, but how come, I voted for a particular thing, but how come Elon Musk is flying in from Davos, from the World Economic Forum, or Vivek Ramaswamy, and these people who are nobody voted for are basically determining who your president is, because there is a structure now that is above the nation state. Just nobody's talking about it, and they're occupying the position of the Pope. So it's this weird anti-Christendom. It's this antichrist like system, if you want to put it that way. And the people need to wake up to that and say, no, I mean, you have no authority. By what authority are you abrogating our our autonomy, our self-determination, our votes? By what authority? And it rests, their authority rests on the same authority that an imam's authority rests on in Persia, or that the Pope's authority rested on in the Middle Ages. So it can be challenged. And the first person who challenges that, and there have been people who have challenged British free market imperialism, but we've called them dictators. We've demonized them, said that they were Satan, and these were people who got out of the debt-based system. They basically had the government do the currency, so that they didn't have central bank debt-based currency. Their economies flourished, and we murdered them. Like Gaddafi is one. Yeah, Gaddafi was one in North Africa, where he had a flourishing system where, like, he had the highest GDP in Africa. And couples would get like a free car when they got married, a free house, gasoline was free. He would give wealth back to the people. The wealth belonged to the people. That's a novel concept, right? That it wasn't siphoned out and went to the IMF and to 6 oligarchs. Adolf Hitler was another one who got off debt-free currency. Abraham Lincoln got off a debt-free, and you get a bullet in the head. That's the theme here. The people who basically try to get out of the system. And when they do get out of the system and you see, wow, that system is flourishing and we're poor, and they have 10 kids and I have a dog, they can afford, like Adam Smith said that. He said the true measurement of a society's wealth is not fiat currency. It's not fake Chuck E. Cheese tokens. He said, how many kids can you have? How many kids can you afford to have? And that's the true measure of wealth. And by that measurement, you see charlatans like Ben Shapiro going around, oh, well, look, everybody's richer after capitalism, and capitalism is such a wonderful system. Look at all these Chuck E. Cheese tokens. Like, okay, Ben, how many kids can the average person afford? How much land can the average person afford? Their grandparents could have a farm and goats and cherry trees and pear trees and chickens. And, how much land can the average person afford, or how many children? And then you realize really quickly, they're actually poorer than their grandparents. Than their great grandparents. That African village, when it was whole and had its own culture and traditions and farms, that they lived at a much higher standard of living than being in a mine, being whipped to get lithium for electric vehicles, so that leftists in San Francisco can virtue signal. So that, yeah, we need to go back to our own cultures, our own religions, and realize that money is not the top of the society. And but that will be derided as racism. Oh, you want your own culture? Okay, racist.
Yeah.
So
I can see how that argument gets made for sure. Like, you, what you think that these people should be separate, that they should be segregated by ideology and everything else? Well, that does sound like that is very much a dream. I'm certainly feeling a lot more sympathetic towards traditionalism than I have earlier in my life. Had a little bit of progressive brainwashing, perhaps, but nowadays I am just way more on board with the idea of like, hey, I'd like to just own some land and some chickens. We'll have to see how it goes, but
well, you're in Panama, so I mean, like, it would be cool. I mean, before the paramilitary gangs show up,
yeah,
if Trump does want to, the economic hitmen show up and start, their shenanigans. I mean, Panama has a lot of good things happening about it. There's a lot of freedom in some of these places, and just wonderful things. But
yeah.
there's hope.
I got a flight coming out of here anyway, so we'll see. Maybe I'll be back, but I did want to switch to a different subject. So you did a really good job, I think, laying out like what the ideal would be or where the masses should go, what direction the people should go in. But I am not. I'm hesitant to say that I think that will actually come to pass, at least in the next, we'll say, under the Trump administration. Perhaps in the upcoming, like 2032 is one year that at least Martin Armstrong, the economist, he points to so often as being like, okay, this is really when the third wave like turns, like that sort of thing. I'm curious though about subjects like the North American Union and the idea of nation states not necessarily disappearing, but integrating together into these larger regional blocks. Specifically with regard to the Anglo-American Empire. Now, I've heard recently that who was it? I believe it was Ray Dalio referred to the United Kingdom as being in a death spiral at this point. Do you see these nation states dissolving of their own accord in any kind of peaceful manner, or is it just going to be they're reintegrated into these larger economic blocks?
Well, I mean, everything comes down to their system is economics. Economics is the top, and that is, there's no other consideration. You will mass murder entire continents. It doesn't matter as long as GDP goes up a nickel. And so essentially, from my analysis, the British Empire were bankrupted after World War One, and they had to make some hard choices. And there's a great book. I think I mentioned it to you before. It's called Dream Worlds of Race. And it's by a British academic, a professor. I think he's at Oxford, and he documents the British plans to basically reabsorb the United States. They called it the reunited states, and that's when the United States goes back into the British grid. And they called them the settler colonies. They wanted to get the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, and they were going to create an Anglo bloc from that. And then from that Anglo bloc, they were going to create a larger world, kind of what we would think of as the United Nations, right? And they were conceptualizing this back in the 1870s. And they said the most likely way that we will get the United States in is through a treaty. We can trick them through a treaty. And they tried several times and failed because we had a comparable Senate, we had a competent Senate. And then they very wisely went and changed how we got senators, in 1917, to make sure that they could destroy the Senate, the quality of the people in the Senate. And because they had stopped them, they had stopped the United States joining the League of Nations. They had stopped the United States joining an international court. All these international structures that the British that were sock puppets for the British. They had created these offshore maritime, things that everything is sea based, maritime law. And so our senators were like, no, I'm not giving up our sovereignties. Go jump off a bridge. We're not doing it. And finally, they got their way after World War II. Essentially, they'd lowered the level of the Senate, and finally they signed on to NATO. And at that point, they're like, "Ha, I got you." But anyway, but the way it happened, the British Empire, and they talk. Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie told them. He said, a prerequisite of creating the Anglo bloc is you have to get rid of India. You have to get rid of your African colonies, because he said you have to use force, which costs money, to basically hold India, because they're a different culture.
Sure.
Right. If you go to the English speaking zones, you can be more manipulative, and you can kind of trick them into coming on and making your, oh, well, we're all English speakers. We all have the same, fairy tales and stories and background and Shakespeare, Beatles, and he talked about that too. He said the Americans would be disinclined to rejoin England because they hate the redcoats. So we're going to have to change the culture. He said that back in 1903. And so that's when they did their whole, post World War II, the Beatles, British invasion. And it really was a British invasion. They took over the culture. James Bond, just to go back to that, and England got the opposite. England was Elvis and James Dean and Marilyn Monroe. So they created this kind of transatlantic culture. Very cynically and very, very purposely. But yeah, so England, essentially, they were bankrupted after World War I, and they had to reconstitute in a new economic form. And like I always like to point to like a holding company, right? Like when a billionaire wants to protect himself, he will have this like a holding company at the top, and then underneath, and he can't basically be sued. If he's sued for taxes or something, any money that's in that holding company is largely protected, largely. And then underneath that holding company, he will have LLCs, right? Underneath the holding company, he'll have LLCs. And so I basically said the British Empire became what we think of as the UN, right? Where they basically are that holding company at the top, and their assets are protected, and they've got LLCs, which are smaller nation states that they control in this system. And so they get all the benefits of an empire without any of the liabilities, because when they had an official traditional empire, they had to build the roads. They had to spend money on aqueducts. They had to spend money on policing and all this kind of stuff. But now with this new system, they get all the resources from all these countries. They basically get to call all the shots. They get to install the leaders of all these countries without any of the costs associated. So they can be irresponsible economically. So they restructured into this. So the British Empire existed. It just existed as the UN, and NATO. And so basically, when the United States linked up to England with NATO, that became the Anglo-American Empire. So from 1949 on, we've been living in the Anglo-American Empire. And that's why it doesn't matter who you vote for. There is no constitution. That's why you can criticize George Washington. You can say Thomas Jefferson was raping his slaves. You can demean the founding fathers of what was once the U.S. You cannot demean Churchill. If you go against Churchill, all the neocons will, how could you say anything Churchill? Because that's the new founding father of this system, of the Anglo-American Empire, where you can be disrespectful to the Americans. You cannot disrespect Churchill.
All right. Very interesting. Well, geez, I am wondering, I guess, how this is going. If Ray Dalio was correct and the United Kingdom is in its own death spiral, they won't be remaining at the top then. They will not be able to remain the holding company with the NATO and with the UN as LLCs beneath it. Am I right?
Well, they think of like a mouse with toxoplasmosis, right? So the mouse with toxoplasmosis is being controlled by this bacterium that's hacked its neurological system, and it turns off its fear responses, and the mouse now is going toward cats, and it likes cats suddenly. It's lost its fear of cats, and what's happening is the bacterium is using the mouse as a vector to jump to a larger host. And so the British Empire, basically the financial class of the British Empire that was once in the Netherlands, this whole financial system, and Ray Dalio is very, very capable at talking about the Dutch Republic. And they invented the stock market. They invented the limited liability corporation. Like they had the first global reserve currency. So the Dutch Republic, they were the first kind of republic that didn't have kings, didn't have the church, took crosses off their flag. They were actually called the United Provinces, was one of their names, the United Provinces. So when you look at the United States, it was built off of this template from the first Dutch Republic in 1588, and this rule by corporation, and So the financial class, the international financial class, was in the Netherlands until it ran its course. Then they jumped to England. William of Orange was a Dutch guy, and he was put on the British throne. And that's when like the Dutch East India Company merges kind of with the British East India Company. And, so all that finance and all the stock market, the bourses, everything goes to London. And then after London runs its course, it goes to the United States. The mouse has been eaten by a larger cat, and it's jumped over. And so it's kind of like one of those horror movies where there's like some like demon in a person and it jumps from person to person, and you can't get the demon because once you you shoot the bad serial killer, it's jumped into a new host. And now the movie keeps going on and on. It's kind of like that, where they jump from country to country to country as it runs its course. And so that's what I see happening. But eventually the system will unwind. It will reinvent itself. Like Lord William Rees-Mogg, who I mentioned, the financial advisor for Lord Rothschild, he said these large nation states, basically the trend from the 19th century on was consolidation and much bigger. Everything bigger is better, right? Bigger nation states. You don't want a tiny little country. You want a giant empire, And he said that model is, like he said, technology is going to undermine that model because technology is by its very essence decentralizing, right? So you're not going to get this centralization of all these massive states. For instance, eBay, right? Like before, if you wanted to buy or trade, you'd have to go to a capital. I'd have to go to Paris or New York or London. Now, because of technology, you can do it from your bedroom in your pajamas. We can have this conversation. And if you looked underneath the top half of me, you would realize that I'm in pajamas with slippers with bunnies on them. I don't actually have bunnies, but anyway, but the point being, you can do things in a decentralized fashion that so you don't need a Paris anymore. You don't need a London. You don't need a New York. This centralized model is starting to break down and become decentralized. So you're going to start getting smaller states. The EU is going to break up and it's going to go back to smaller states, at which point new bonds get to be generated. So they don't really care about nation states. They just care about bonds, the creation of bonds and geopolitical interests and natural resources and stuff like that, and I mean, eventually the whole system will reinvent itself into the ground. Technology is going to have catastrophic influences on what was the old system that we've been used to for the last 300 years. And we will see, and Elon Musk is going to be part of that. And all these people, technocrats, are going to be part of that because they are terrified of the fourth industrial revolution and all of the unemployment. They're going to institute UBI, universal basic income. And it's not going to be enough. They're going to think, okay, well, we can kind of, have a surveillance state and give people welfare, and there won't be destabilization, but there will be destabilization because there always is in these shifts, from England in the 1700s to the revolutions of 1848 in Central Europe. Another big thing, I wanted to make this point really quickly. Karl Marx didn't understand. He said, okay, the Industrial Revolution happens in England. So of course, England's going to go through a revolution, but they never did. And he didn't understand why. And I was listening to Machiavelli, and Machiavelli explains it. Machiavelli, back in the 1500s, he says that empires, they can use colonies as a safety valve. So if you have a dissident or you have like a revolutionary or a malcontent person, you can send them, like the Carthaginians. If the Carthaginians had somebody who was causing trouble, they would say, oh, you're going to our colony in Spain, or you're going to our colony in wherever, Morocco, whatever. And they would send them off to these colonies, and they could maintain their stability. England could do that. If you were like a rebel in England, okay, you're on a ship to Australia, or you're on a ship to Massachusetts. And so they had a safety valve mechanism to get rid of the angry people. Whereas in Central Europe, where they were landlocked and they didn't have all these colonies, they had to deal with their own populace. They couldn't there was no mechanism for them to get rid of them, so that has always been like for empires, colonies have always been a safety valve. What we're watching now is very interesting because historically you would send people away. Now they're sending people in. You're getting the Vivek Ramaswamis. You're getting like massive infinity Indians, So it's weird. This, like, now there's this two-way system, and I'm not sure that social cohesion can be maintained with endless mass migration. They like it for the short term because it tamps down on nationalism and political rights, right? The people can't get together, they can't get political rights, and so it's a very good tool to get rid of political rights. But yeah, I mean, that's why the revolution did not happen in England, and that's why it happened in Central Europe in 1848, because there was no mechanism for them to get rid of the Zachary Newells. Zachary, go to Panama. We can get rid of Zachary, and there's not going to be a revolution.
Well, geez, they kind of forced me out in a sense. Like, I'm certainly a lot better off down here than I am up there, even though the cost of living here in Panama is not like you would think of Latin America. But nonetheless.
It's expensive now.
Yeah, it's expensive, at least in this area. I think that if you go further inland, it will get a lot cheaper, but we'll have to see. I don't know. I'm thinking about Mexico still, but that's largely because a lot of the things that you've been talking about so far, like at least several minutes ago, you were talking about the need for human beings to go back to more traditional ways of life, like living on farms and so on. I see a lot of that happening with Derek Bros, and I don't know if you're familiar with this journalist, Derek Bros. He has the People's Reset, was a convention that he ran with a few other folks last year, or not, sorry, not last year, last month. And Hervoe had filmed some interviews there. And it was all about regenerative agriculture. There was also some stuff about cryptocurrency from some of the speakers. And that is something that I'd like to bring up in reference to what you were just saying about technology, because cryptocurrency was definitely sold as being something super decentralized, was going to give us back a kind of liberty to the common folk. But now it's being absorbed back into the Anglo-American financial system. And
yeah,
I'm wondering what you see happening as far as other attributes of the fourth industrial revolution, like DeepSeek, the AI model that was recently debuted from China. That's supposedly a lot more decentralized. Like the reason it caused such a hit to Nvidia's stock price is because they don't need to have 1,000 GPUs in a data center. It's more decentralized. So I'm wondering if you see any potential for them, for the ruling class, to overcome any of the disruptive elements of the fourth industrial revolution, or do you just think it's kind of a done deal? Like the people are going to revolt because there's just no way that they could clamp down on that.
Well, the people who have been running things since 1600, right? So we're centuries into this experiment. They're not very good at social systems, right? So if you look at Islam or you look at Catholicism in the Middle Ages, these were social systems. They had social machinery. And so you could rely on a certain baseline level of ethical behavior from the people within these social systems. So they wouldn't run around raping, killing, they weren't feral, fatherless populations. As when you have a feral fatherless population, suddenly you need police to kind of make sure that there's baseline stability to keep the supply chains running. And the system as it runs now is crude, predatory, and it ignores social systems to the extent where it's almost contemptuous of them. Like Republican talking points. Oh, we don't want to legislate morality. We don't want any ethical. Okay, well then what are you legislating? If you don't want to legislate morality, what are you legislating? And it's this very immoral system, that ignores that human beings need families, they need land, they need like breathing space to be functional, so that they're not, and their solution thus far has been, okay, well, we've taken everything from you, you're in a void, you're going crazy, like Dostoevsky talks about that in Notes from the Underground, the nihilism that arises when the Industrial Revolution hit Russia, right? So all of a sudden, all the social systems had broken down. Nobody believes in God. There's no church. And he said most of these mental illnesses arose from boredom. The people were just so bored and inactive. They felt like the inertia. He uses the term inertia over and over again. And I was explaining to my son, I said that, of course, inertia would happen in kind of like that cultural vacuum. You've stripped away their culture, their 1,000-year-old culture. You stripped it away. And what they're told is materialism, prosperity, that this will be a Band-Aid for the loss of your culture. And I said inertia is not just an object in motion tends to stay at motion. It's also an object at rest tends to stay at rest. So you're kind of like, you're immobile, you're immobilized. And I said, under Christendom, as an example, Aristotle talked about, what causes movement in the universe, particles. And he said, everything has to be moved by something else. And he said, if you trace it back, there had to have been a prime mover. And he called that the unmoved mover, which was his term for God, right? So if you remove God, if you remove the unmoved mover, then nothing moves. everything is just, inertia, and you're just locked. You don't know what to do with yourself. And the only escape from that is into insanity. J.G. Ballard said that. He talked about in these overly like dystopian, tyrannical regimes where everything is, every moment is apportioned out. Your only freedom is an escape into insanity. And you see that when people are like, I'm a furry, or I'm a comic book character, they're escaping because they don't have freedom in any other aspect of their lives. It's like, shut up, sit down, pay your taxes, put a mask on, and they're serfs, they're debt slaves from the time they're in college. Here, get a credit card, get in that debt as soon as possible, and so there's no freedom for these people. They're working for other people. They're working to make sure that some usurer gets the money, from their labor, because they've been put in debt so early on. And so I mean, this system that is based on materialism with nothing above it, no social system above it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like under Catholicism as an example, or Islam, or any of these, you would have a calendar, and that calendar would have saints days and feast days and fasting days and stuff like that. And the average person, they could unite together, during a feast day. They could unite together. There was community. There was a sense of family, and they kind of tore that away. And now it's like, sodomy day or donut day, these stupid things, because they didn't know what to do when they tore away that previous social system. There wasn't really anything. Okay, well, archetypal behavior? What should I emulate to be a good person? And it used to be, emulate Saint Abernathy or Saint, Jude or whatever. And now it's, okay, Brad Pitt. They're a celebrity is your archetypal behavior. They're drinking Starbucks coffee, so I should be drinking Starbucks. And that was their solution to having no social systems. And when you don't have any social systems, I mean, so essentially, where I'm going with this is, you asked about cryptocurrencies and stuff like that. Governments, 9/10 of government power came from regulation of the currency. And now, if you have this British imperial. British free market imperialism. You have this World Economic Forum above the nation states, and they're saying, you know what, we're going to create this new model. We're getting rid of the nation states altogether. So we're going to take away 9/10 of their power, which is their currency. We're going to create this crypto system, right? And it will bypass the nation states. So this will be the last kind of nail in the coffin of that model that we had been running. So, so for a long time, we said, okay, we're going to throw away these social systems. We're going to throw away the church. And like I said, I'm not even talking about religion or dogma. I'm just saying social systems, where the community goes, who controls the images of the society. Like everybody in the Middle Ages, if I said, Cain and Abel, they would know what that meant, or Noah, they would know what that meant. Those were the stories of the society. That was the TV. Those were the images, and all the stained glass windows, all the architecture. Whoever controls that is controlling society. They're controlling the social machinery. And now we're in a system where they paid very little attention. They tore away the social machinery. They basically had this economic system that is decoupled from that social machinery. It's decoupled from any ethical system, right? So now it's a predatory, sociopathic system with no social machinery. And and like I said, like I was watching Sean Hannity, and he was talking to some governor candidate in Pennsylvania, and they were talking about how you need guns, and you need guns, to protect yourself, and this, that, and the other, and I was looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and safety is like the very bottom, right? Like self-actualization is at the very top, right? But safety is at the very bottom. That's like an animal need, right? And so safety, I need a gun to be safe. Rather than, let's have social systems that don't require you to have a gun because there are no feral criminals out, right? So let's have families, and 9/10 of these sociological problems will go away, because we know they go away because we've seen the alternative. Like there's a thing called the Rossetto effect. If you read the Malcolm Gladwell's book, the Outliers, I think it's called, the Rossetto effect. Anybody can look that up. And when you have social cohesion, heart disease goes down, cancer rates go down, criminality goes down. So you don't need men with guns, on watchtowers and living in a surveillance state when you have a robust social machinery. But they took the social machinery away, and their solution is, okay, well, we're not going to fix the problems of society, and encourage families and have tax rebates. If you have 4 kids, you don't pay taxes anymore. Whatever. There are ways to do this. Hungary's doing this right now. Australia gives you tax rebates for the more children you have. So you can actually do this. You can encourage family and stability. but they're not. And the Republican solution is, okay, well, we're still going to have the dystopia, but you can have a gun. And it's like, why don't we get rid of the dystopia? Why don't we? Is it possible to get rid of the dystopia? No.
I'm curious, since you mentioned Republicans again, how would you view the Democrats in this scenario?
Oh, there is no. I mean, there are no Democrats or Republicans. There's two groups of people, and they both hold up the same system, just from different aspects. Like I was talking to this lady, she was a professor in a university, and she thought of herself as very liberal, Furman University, she said. And her sister is a woman of the name. Her name is Holly Monster. She's works in an embassy in Africa, and that's how I started talking to this lady. And she was telling me of how wonderful it is, for as a Western liberal woman to go in and teach the African women that they can be more than mothers, and they can be part of the economic kind of global grid, and they can, they can be like her. They can be like a single mother or a single woman with a dog, and they don't really need families, and and gay marriage, and they need our values. They don't really need their own cults. And she didn't realize she was an apostle for this evil system to come in and kind of destroy their society, their culture, their social cohesion. And Robert T. Kaplan talks about that. He starts his book, it's called The Anarchy, I think, and he goes to Africa, and the crime that is just insane. He said you needed a bodyguard from going from your car to the restaurant, the 10 feet that you would be mugged. And he talked about like the fatherlessness, the tribal structure had broken down because of this system that this woman was advocating for. And it led to this explosion in crime, murder, rape. And so she thinks of herself as a good liberal. She's just, but they definitely need to get rid of their own culture. And they definitely need to have Walmarts and have like debt and credit cards and central banks. And then they'll be free like she is. She doesn't realize that she's a tool for very illiberal idea, So you have the Republicans are kind of like the free market, stupid, the free market, not, and their base does, the Republican base, like they love the libertarian Ron Paul, free market, and they don't know about British free market imperialism. What you're saying is that there's going to be a system above the nation state, outside your control, and that the free market is what should determine things. The free market. So they're being told this ideology that they don't even realize what it means. What that means, what the free market means, the free market should rule is Klaus Schwab is your leader. So you have both sides abetting Klaus Schwab. Both sides are from their own, one sees himself as a liberal, one sees himself as a conservative, but they both agree that the only system is this system, and that everybody else would benefit by having British parliamentary democracy and a central bank. So yeah, there is no solution. There's no political solution. The solution is cultural. It is religious. It is spiritual. People need to get plugged back into the earth, and the earth, it will plug you back into God. You will be in touch with your, like look at the Amish. How much gender dysphoria exists among Amish children who have to milk cows, or have to deal with bulls, or have to deal with like baseline reality? How many gender confused donkeys are there on these farms? Not many. So when you're in touch with the earth, when you see nature, when you're in touch with nature, your mental illnesses go away. Your boredom induced nihilism, that Dostoevsky describes right before the Russian Revolution, by the way, right? So in the lead up to the Russian Revolution, the Industrial Revolution comes, everything collapses, everybody's depressed, miserable, and it leads to this social enemy, this moral collapse, this moral decay, and everybody's miserable. And I'm looking at the Middle Ages, and I'm looking at the way the peasants lived in the Middle Ages, how much they didn't work. Half of the year was just feast days and saint days, and they weren't taxed. Like they were taxed at like 10%. We're taxed at like 60%, the average, like American, and I'm looking and I'm like, okay, no debt slavery. Everybody was employed. There was like, very little rape or murder or malfeasance and stuff, larceny. And I'm like, that system doesn't look so bad to me at this point. So when people are like, oh, the dark ages don't seem so dark to me. It's since the Enlightenment, the Luciferian Enlightenment that we're living in, that I'm very skeptical now of this system. So, but I think this system eventually will collapse. All systems must, and then when it collapses, people are going to reconstitute along spiritual lines. Like look at Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, and he's very synthetic, I know, but nevertheless, he was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and the way that he organized was through the churches. Same thing with imams in Israel. When there's no nation state, they organize. The organizing principle is the mosque, or the church, or the temple, whatever. And so once this system collapses, once the nation state system collapses, and it's the people who have created the system want it to collapse. So it will collapse. There will be no United States of America. There will be no Canada. 3 generations from now. This will be a very, very different looking globe. And we need to make sure, however, that when it does collapse, it's not reconstituted to where Klaus Schwab and Elon Musk have all the power, but that it's constituted in a way that human beings can be human, where the solution isn't, the system is anti-human, but we're not going to change the system. We're going to change you. We're going to give you drugs, and we're going to give you a chemical lobotomy. And, or we're going to meld man with machine, and you'll be part of the machine, and it's like, or how about you change the system? How about we have legitimate grown-up style social machinery, like we have historically, and right now we're flying without any social machinery. We're flying without any adult political class. They're really good at money, but they're not so good at social machinery. They're not so good at, and that's, like the Republicans are poster children for that. Money. It's the economy's stupid. And then Democrats are just gone. They used to be for the working class. They went over to Wall Street. They're gone. I mean, it's a fake right and a fake left. And like I said, no political solution. There's a human solution and a spiritual solution.
Well, that sounds wonderful. That the solution that you've described actually brings a warm feeling to my heart. So that's got to count for something, I think. I don't know if everyone will feel that way, but I kind of expect they will. Like, we're all human. How could anybody really have another alternative kind of feeling compared to mine? Like, how could somebody be hearing something like, oh, having community and going back to the land and feeling like a human being, not being depressed and over-medicated and all of these different things? Nobody would reject that.
If you were in an Amish community, Zachary, there would be a female Zachary. There would be like some, like in a community structure, there would be a young lady. She would pair off with you. You would have 6 children, and this is what people like. They were very good at the marketing department of the system. Totally misled people about things Karl Marx was a tool, an actor of the same people who did the revolutions of 1848. They basically had him write the Communist Manifesto. They were called the League of the Just.
In 1848, right?
If you look up the League of the Just, these were the people who ran the revolutions. They were the George Soroses of that time, and they got Karl Marx to, he was one of the authors in the Communist Manifesto. But anyway, so I'm not like, oh, Karl Marx, because communism existed before Karl Marx. There was a guy named Robert Owen, and what they distracted the public from was what Robert Owens was saying was, okay, the Industrial Revolution came. It caused all this disruption. It caused food prices to skyrocket, farms to collapse. It caused all these orphans, like an explosion of orphans, because when all the young men were lured into the cities, there was no young women. There was no social machinery like there was in their village for them to marry, for them to pair up with a woman. So prostitutes came in. When prostitutes came in, there was an explosion of orphans. And then you get this Oliver Twist type dystopia. We've only avoided that now through abortion. You don't see all the orphanages you used to in the 19th century because now we're just killing them. That's not a good long-term solution. And so Robert Owen, looking at all of this evil, he basically said, we need to get back to the land. We need to get back to community. Communism, it was about community. It was a Luddite reaction against the Industrial Revolution. And he said the solution to this is Amish style. That his vision of communism was not Soviet Union with large factories and Joseph Stalin and police states and surveillance states and secret police. No, it was an Amish community. That was his concept. That is, and that really is the solution. And you don't need to call it communism. You could just call it feudalism. You could call it the Middle Ages. You could call it 99% of human history was this model that Robert Owen wanted to go back to. And they very successfully stigmatized that. They put an ism to it. They pathologized it. Kind of like somebody said, demisexual. They had the description of demisexual and all these new invented sexualities. And it was like demisexual is somebody who can only have sex with somebody that they love. And somebody commented, they were like, great, they pathologized normal human behavior. That's normal human. There's no that's just being a normal human. So communism, you don't need to use that fake label. It's just called, hey, I want land in a family. Land in a familyism, you know? And it was a Luddite reaction against the Industrial Revolution. And so, yeah, so most of the stuff we've been dealing with has been as a result of these industrial revolutions. And now we're going through the fourth one. And so now there's a lot of people in positions of power. They're like, crap. We don't know what to do. We're not very good at social machinery like the church used to be or Islam used to be. We're not good at this. We tore away the social machinery and we just had this predatory economic system without any of the accompanying infrastructure. What do we do? Crap. What do we do? And their solution has been, okay, well, surveillance. We're going to do mass surveillance and we're going to have, influencers and we're going to manipulate them in, whatever, have them playing video games and they won't notice that they're poor and living in a cardboard box, or plug in their head with a Neuralink and we will give them this fake reality that, no, it's like, you don't need to do any of that. Just give people, have an Amish style situation, give a guy a wife, give him some cows, 40 acres and a mule. And you don't need revolutions. You don't need secret police and all this infrastructure. But so much of the system is based on, this retarded, like I said, going back to Sean Hannity, oh, well, everybody should have a gun. Or Sean, you get rid of the dystopia and you don't need a gun, or you can have a gun to, hunt if you want to hunt or skeet shoot, or if you like guns, you really love guns. But don't tell me, that the solution is guns. And you're not going to touch the dystopia. You're not going to touch the social problems of fatherlessness, and you're not going to, it's like, I don't know, very, very frustrating. Watch it. Like once again, like our medical thing, they address the symptoms, but never the underlying disease. It's always the symptoms and they never cure the underlying disease. So the symptom is the individual crime and you with a gun, but the underlying disease is they tore away the social systems that would give people families. And without families, I mean, there's no society. You can't have a civil society. Aristotle talked about that. The baseline unit of any civilization is the family, and he said, once you have a bunch of families together, they're cousins, and you have a tribe, which is a group of cousins. And then we have a group of tribes, that's a nation. But the atom of it, the building block, the Lego block at the center of that is the family. And that's the solution, Sean Hannity, is you subsidize families, you encourage families, you give them tax rebates, you make it idealized. You have movies where the family, that you have like the strong father figure who's wise, and you have the mother who's, helping her children and doing, you make them the heroes of society instead of, the single person with the cat in a cubicle, people as an economic unit. Oh, your value is an economic unit. And once your economic unit value goes, then of course we kill you. We send you to a maid chamber in Canada and we have you do assisted suicide because you're no longer valuable economically. That system has to go because that system, like I said, is anti-human. You don't kill your grandparents because they can't be in the hamster wheel. And that's another danger of cryptocurrencies, by the way, is that cryptocurrencies can be, they have expiration dates, like in China, like they're experimenting with your money being shut off so that you can never save, right? So if you don't spend all like that $1,000 at the end of the month, it disappears, it goes to zero and it has an expiration date, which means you cannot ever save and you can't pass on wealth to subsequent generations. So, which means that you have to be constantly working in that hamster wheel. And once you get too old and you can no longer work, well, then they'll just euthanize you. That's the solution that they've come up with, and that's what a bunch of people, Dr. David Martin and stuff like that. He's kind of a charlatan too, but he's right. I mean, he was talking just very recently, he was talking about, that Social Security, there's not enough money and their solution is kind of euthanizing old people, sending them to the hospitals, injecting them with stuff where you're like, oh, this is the cure, but it's actually the cure to the economic system, which is killing them, and that it's such an evil system. We're killing our elders. We're killing Oliver Twist through abortion. We're like, their solution is killing the people who cannot be viewed through the lens of economic productivity, and then you just have the people in the middle and they're just supposed to be hamsters on a wheel, and once that wheel stops, they just euthanize you. And there's got to be a better system. And there is a better system. We know there's a better system because it was this system for 99% of human history. So I don't know. That's it. I got nothing else, Zachary.
No, hey, I think that's a wonderful place to end. I think that you proposed the system. And really the system is family and community. And it's, even in our conversation, I've thought of so many different ways that I never really considered before that we've been alienated from that. Like, it's amazing that I could have lost any sense of my own humanity, that I could have become estranged from my family, etc. It's unreal,
Yeah,
the
me
kind
too.
of how just how victimized we were by history. It's incredible.
Yep, by economic systems, and the solution is not another economic system. It's not like the solution is something totally different and outside of that. And you know, hopefully, like I said, when we come up with something new, give me a call, and I will show back up, Zachary.
Ha, wonderful. All right, I will think about it and get back to you soon.
Okay, thanks, Zachary.
Thanks. Take care. Have a good one, Daniel. Bye.